that were beginning to take shape a year ago and which have now had a year of implementation, that we take stock of what is working and what is not. Because one of the things that is important, we recognized then and we should recognize today, is that dealing with the issue of forced displacement in ways that are innovative, in ways that bring together the comparative advantage of different parts of the international system, humanitarian and development, is something that is going to be with us for some time to come. And for that reason, I'm very happy that this part of our work, today's event, is a continuation of our partnership with the IRC. And David Miliband is going to be part of the panel, but he and his team have been working closely with us on this. And indeed, we have a joint report which we will be launching today, which takes stock of some of the issues that I mentioned to you. We also have a very distinguished panelist, but I'll leave it to Raj in a few moments to do the introductions for that. Let me just end now by saying that for us at CGD, this issue of refugees, forced displacement, humanitarian assistance, and migration is one of the core areas on which we are expanding our work, because we do feel that there are opportunities to find better ways to support this agenda by particularly bringing together the different strands of the international system that work on this agenda. And we will be launching this at the end of May with a conference at which Louise Arbour will also be here. And I would very much like to welcome all of you who are interested to come to that event and help us as we think our way through together on trying to find solutions to this set of issues. So with that, I'm going to invite Sarah Charles, there's Sarah sitting there, who's a senior director at IRC, and Cindy Huang, who's a senior policy fellow at CGD. This is, by the way, the motors of this machine. You know, this is how we keep this partnership moving forward, to come and talk about our new report, and then we'll set the stage for the conversation with the panelists.
Thank you, Masood. We'll try and keep the motor moving quickly through these remarks. IRC is really pleased to partner with CGD on this work, and we look forward to continuing this joint effort. We're excited to release today a new brief that looks at how the international community is tackling the realities of protracted displacement, what we're getting right, and what still needs to change. In 2016, we saw the international community finally acknowledge that protracted displacement was a collective challenge to be tackled with development and not just humanitarian responses. Donors and host governments committed to policy changes and investments that would enable self-reliance among refugees and support their hosts. UNHCR launched its comprehensive refugee response framework, and the World Bank stepped in with much-needed new and flexible financing for host countries. As member states come together to negotiate a global compact for refugees this year, we sought to, one, look at how these new instruments are working together in the field and provide recommendations for how to drive impact, and two, draw links between what's happening in countries hosting large numbers of refugees and the policy discussions happening in Geneva, New York, and here in DC. This report starts to look at progress in Ethiopia and Uganda and continues to track progress in Jordan. Looking back over the last 18 months, we wanted to know, are the new models working? Are we seeing real improvements in people's lives? And if not, what needs to change? Overall, good news. Progress is starting to take hold. In Ethiopia, Uganda, and Jordan, we see real government leadership on planning and steady progress on policy commitments, from the issuance of work permits in Jordan to the integration of refugees in Uganda's National Development Plan. We also see the catalytic role that the World Bank financing is having on the ground and delivering on the promise of 2016. But we still have a ways to go, and a few key ingredients are missing to drive real impact. We heard from multiple stakeholders that the bank has been the essential actor in keeping up momentum from 2016, commitment that so far has not been matched by other donors. In Ethiopia and Uganda, UNHCR's refugee response framework process and the World Bank financing have rolled out over a similar time period. But the linkages between the two processes are still a bit unclear. Stakeholders report frequent but ad hoc consultation and a fair amount of confusion about the link between consultation and decisions. Clarifying these processes could speed decision-making and lead to more coherent programming and potentially lay down a roadmap for other donors to come in behind. Finally, host country policy commitments are clear and widely understood, but the intended outcomes of the comprehensive refugee response framework and the bank financing is not yet clear. Collective agreement on these outcomes and related targets by a wide variety of stakeholders, most critically refugees themselves, is a must to ensure that this new development financing actually improves lives. Much more detail is in the brief. I hope that you grab a copy on your way out. And with that, Cindy.
Sarah gave an excellent overview of humanitarian development collaboration on the ground and how lessons can and should inform global frameworks. My task is to raise some questions about how innovations in refugee response can and should inform development financing more broadly. A major innovation, and one that may not yet be fully appreciated, is the World Bank's introduction of special concessional or subsidized financing for programs to benefit both hosts and refugees. The bank offers lower loan rates for middle-income countries and additional concessional financing for low-income countries. The subsidy is, in effect, for the provision of a public good for additional benefits to the region and the world. In the case of hosting refugees, this includes preserving regional stability and fulfilling moral and legal obligations by recognizing and supporting refugee rights. So, what are the next set of challenges related to displacement and fragility, and how can flexible financing help us meet them? We are not investing enough across a range of global issues: internal displacement, disaster and pandemic preparedness, conflict prevention, climate change. Nor are we adequately responding to their interconnections, for example, the links between climate change and displacement. Collective action to confront these challenges and the institutions that facilitate collective action are needed now more than ever. A key part of the solution will be financing that incentivizes investments in prevention, preparedness, and early response that reduce costs down the road. I look forward to hearing ideas from our august panelists on how we can make progress at a difficult time. I want to acknowledge that one of the inspirations for this event is the 2016 report of the high-level panel on the future of multilateral development banking, co-directed by Nancy Birdsall, who I know who will have more to say on this topic. When I started my career at Doctors Without Borders, I never thought that I would feel passionate about the differential pricing of loans. Through conversations with Nancy, I've been inspired about this and more. And her work and that of the high-level panel lays out a compelling vision for how major new investments in global public goods are not only needed, but within our reach. Many thanks to all of you, and special thanks to my co-authors, Sarah, Lauren Post, and Kate Goff, and to IRC for our very productive partnership across the humanitarian development divide. It's my pleasure and honor to invite the panelists to the stage, as well as Raj Kumar, president and editor of DevEx, who will moderate the discussion. Thank you so much.
Well done.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. You're hearing me? Am my mic on? Looks like it is. We are, to Cindy's point, we are going to get into a topic that includes things like differential pricing of loans. And I know looking around this room, there are a number of people here who know what that means and are steeped in this. But we also have people joining us online from around the world. We have people in the audience today who may be new to this topic. And I just want to assure you that although you're going to hear a lot of acronyms and technical terms and mechanisms that come out of this panel, there's actually a couple of really big, kind of earth-shaking ideas that are underpinning the conversation today. And we're going to divide our discussion really into two parts under those two really big ideas. And the center has done a fantastic job because the 4 people here joining me are actually people who have originated those ideas and pushed them very much forward. So you're hearing it right from the horse's mouth in this discussion today. The 2 big ideas are this. The first, I wasn't looking at you on that. No. The 2 big ideas are this.
Assuring our very distinguished panelists next to me that you were not. Anyway, you carry on.
Not too far.
Disregard the comments from the back of the classroom. The first big idea is this. Refugees have long been seen as a humanitarian problem. They're a problem to be solved. The new idea out there today is that actually they're a development asset, that there's an entirely different way to look at this. And if you frame it right, countries that previously we see as suffering under the burden of refugees can actually use them as a part of a broader plan that helps citizens of the country as well as the newly arrived to put the country on a new path to development. So a really big idea. When you think of the number of countries around the world that have large refugee populations, it's a really massive idea. That's what we're going to focus on in the first part of the discussion. We're then going to get into a conversation about, well, what about the international system itself? Is there a way in a world that feels so fragmented and that has so many cross-cutting issues that don't just touch any one country, is there a way we can actually tackle those? And in particular, can we tackle those global public goods using the architecture that exists, including in this town, including the institution you represent, Kristalina? Is there a way to reimagine the Bretton Woods institutions to tackle things like climate change or forced displacement? Are there ways to do that? And again, we've got the right people here to have that discussion. So I want to launch right in with Kristalina Georgieva, who, as you all know, is the CEO of the World Bank. And in fact, I was just thinking, Kristalina, before getting up, that I think it was in 2012 that Bob Zoellick, the former president of the World Bank, penned an article in Foreign Affairs, and the title was Why We Need the World Bank, or Why We Still Need the World Bank. It wasn't that long ago, people were debating the very relevancy of the institution. Now we're at a point where everyone says, we need this institution. How do we just make it work better for the kinds of challenges we're talking about today? And this is a great example. Talk to us about the compact, about the concessional financing facility. Is it working, and what is the next step for it?
Well, first, thank you for bringing us together. We actually are a bit of a boring panel because we are very like-minded. But we would do our best to disagree with each other sufficiently for this audience. My genuine commitment as the person who is responsible for IBRD and IDA for the middle-income countries and the poor countries is to make sure that the bank constantly innovates and modernizes, because the world we live in is changing very rapidly. And solutions that may have been great yesterday, already today may not be the right solutions. It was in this spirit, and that is how the bank group would remain relevant, by recognizing very humbly that we ought to stretch ourselves so we remain relevant. We had a very strong push on that topic from people who are here right next to me. And it had 2 parts. One, challenging the bank on how we provide financing to middle-income countries that are providing global public good, be it global public good with regard to climate change, that is not today's discussion, but it is connected, or it is a global public good of hosting people who, for no fault of their own, are displaced from their countries. And we had a particularly severe crisis once the Libya war pushed millions, the Syria war, well, the Libya war did the same thing. But the Syria war was more prominent by getting half of the population of the country displaced internally or across borders. And then there was a very simple message that came from the bank, and Frank Bousquet, who was responsible to operationalize these messages right here in the audience, and it was the following: follow the people in need, not the income level of the countries where they end up being. So if Syrians are in Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey, we have to make sure that we provide concessional finance for the care of people, because for all practical reasons, Syria is no more what it used to be, a middle-income country. And if you apply this simple logic, follow the people in need where they are, then from there you draw the conclusion of concessionality as being actually financially and, of course, morally and ethically being fair. So how do we do this concessionality? By bringing donor finance in the global concessional facility, and then we blend our normal middle-income country loans with this grant component to bring the cost down to what would be normally IDA or poor countries' lending levels. And then the second part of the solution is to say, but what exactly would the money buy? And what it buys is actually care for the host communities that are now being stretched, education, health, jobs, but also care for the refugee community. And by doing so, by investing in this way, we actually make it more plausible for the countries that are hosting to not get into a situation when tensions between host communities and refugees flare up. So, is it working? Yes. What do we need from you, from everybody in this room? Help us to make it work even better. What we face is the necessity to constantly knock on doors and ask for more money. We had the meeting 2 days, well, yesterday. And we were talking about that necessity because the problem is not short-term, the problem is long-term, and therefore concessionality has to be present for as long as the issue is with you. And I think that one plea I have for you and for the report that was just presented, please send it to all the capitals of the donors we go after. Please use this week when you talk to finance ministers from Germany, from authorities from these countries, press upon them. It works. It works.
In a way, though, the bad news is that getting the money, as hard as that might be, is actually the easier part, right? I mean, you referred to this a bit, and I want to bring David and Imad into this in a moment. You know, getting the financing was a huge challenge and a big success to get countries to step up and provide grant funding to reduce the cost of these loans, the differential pricing Cindy referred to. But then you have to have projects that actually can engage refugees, get them into the labor force, still help the host communities, provide the infrastructure and the hospital, not just do traditional development, but a new kind of development.
Yes.
And maybe, David, I can bring you into the discussion on this point. This is hard to do, right? To develop projects like this that actually work is hard to do. How is that going?
Well, I think that it's really important to say that if you had three refugees here, one from Jordan, one from Uganda, one from Ethiopia, the three countries studied, they would say there's a huge amount more to do. And it's my job to bring that spirit into this room, because I am a huge fan of what Jim Kim and Kristalina are doing at the World Bank. They are the most dynamic actor on the international humanitarian development stage. They've brought in new ways of thinking, they've brought new levels of ambition, they've really driven a pivot in the way we think about this as policymakers. But if you think about the distinction between policy and practice, we've got good policy, but we don't yet have good practice on the ground, and that's really what I want to try and speak to in answering your question. From my point of view, I mean, IRC is an NGO in all of the countries that we're talking about. We employ local staff. We work on employment and education, as well as on the more traditional humanitarian efforts in respect of health and water and sanitation. Three things are going to decide the fate of this program, because I'm 100% with Kristalina that we have to show success, but we can't yet tell the donor, we shouldn't be saying to the donors yet that they're off the hook. First of all of my experience from what I see I was in Ethiopia in February, and I was in Uganda and Jordan at the end of last year. Unless you structure the outcomes right, you don't get the incentives right for all the individual players. So unless it's clear what counts as success, then you don't get the incentives right for the host government, you don't get the incentives right for the delivery agencies. Jordan is on the hook for delivering work permits, and they're doing a huge amount. But the truth is, Imad can speak to this better than I, what he cares about is actually getting refugees into work, not just giving them work permits. The permit is a stepping stone, it's not the ultimate product. So getting the incentives right is incredibly important. To do that, you have to get the outcomes clear. Second, there's a very strong commitment, which Kristalina and others have really fostered, which is that this has to be done in a collaborative way. Now, the great danger of collaboration is that you get completely mired in bureaucracy. And it's really important, I think, that we take seriously the need to streamline systems. I mean, the kind of, people, it's easy to complain about government bureaucracy, but multilateral bureaucracy can tie up the best of intentions. And whenever I go to Jordan or Uganda or Ethiopia, I pity for our staff who have to go to millions of coordination meetings, but I also think about the kind of whether or not we're doing enough to streamline systems to promote delivery. And the third thing is about being brave enough to be accountable, not just to have outcomes, not just to have systems, but to actually have the transparency that delivers accountability. And if you when you get a chance to read the report that's come out today, the three big things they highlight are those three areas. Now, just to finish, because I know you don't want long speeches, the reason why I think we should go out of here with a sense of impatience, not just a sense of pride, is that, one, the responsibility stroke burden of dealing with the refugee crisis is massively unequally distributed. I mean, the responsibility for managing this global public good is enormously felt in poor and lower middle income countries, not in rich countries.
Something like 85% of refugees, right? Are in
exactly. So there's a massively unequal, massively unequal distribution. Secondly, the countries that are doing the hosting are bearing a massively unequal responsibility for actually addressing the problem on, so it's not just there are more people in those countries, when it comes to actually addressing the issues that are faced, they're not being given anywhere near the kind of help that they require if they're to actually step up and handle this global, effectively this global public good. It's not easy for Imad to say this because he doesn't want to be in the position of always being Jordan coming along, but you know, he's dealing with a dollar peg, an IMF program, a debt to GDP ratio that's gone up to 94%, Jordanian youth unemployment of 34%, overall unemployment of 18% now. 18.3. And we're saying to him, you've got to do the right thing by refugees, and we'll give you part of the financing to help you do that. That is just not good enough. And so I really feel that we have to address the process issues that are raised in the report today. But we've also got to make sure that there are some ministers here that overall the development community doesn't forget the inequality of responsibility that's currently bedeviling this situation.
And I think you brilliantly, David, gave those prescriptions without using the P word, politics, which fundamentally, you know, the undercurrent of all of these issues, these are deeply political issues in all of the countries that you mentioned, not easy to tackle for that reason.
But I'm very happy to use the political word. I mean, I'm not running a political organization, I'm running a non-political organization, but the idea that you can have a humanitarian or development policy over here and politics over here and never the twain shall meet is just not, right. Is not the real world. And I think that we've got to, there's politics in donor countries about how much money is spent on international humanitarian aid or development aid, but it's a fraction of what people think is spent. But the local politics is real, and my perspective on this is, at the moment, we're not offering the kind of win-win solution to the host countries. Now, Kristalina said something on the way in just here, which is, I don't know if you're able to talk about what you're talking about with the Bangladeshi situation.
Of course.
I think it's a really interesting case study of how you can turn the politics to be manageable from being unmanageable. And that's what we've got to do with the Jordans and the Ugandans and the Ethiopias as well.
And let's get to that Bangladesh case in the second half of this
Okay.
of this programming. But I want to get to Imad Fakhuri, who's the Minister of Planning and International Cooperation in Jordan. Your name has been used many times here because Jordan really was the first compact. It's one of the most affected countries, has maybe the most progress thus far. But the challenges are really deep. David outlined those kind of three categories of challenges. How do you get from where you are now, which is, it was already a big success to get a work permits target. How do you get from that to refining the projects to the point where they're having the kinds of outcomes that everyone wants to be accountable for here?
Thank you, Raj, and thank you to the Center for hosting almost the same panel 1 year ago. And let me put this also, and I think David did a very good job in actually positioning what the Jordan context is today and what we're trying to balance and trying to do more on the refugee side and the way we deal with the refugee influx and so on. For us, I think, I remember very well in March 2015, I wrote a letter to President Kim, Dr. Kim of the World Bank, arguing in that letter, because I started to see what the fiscal space is doing to a host country. I sent a letter to him pitching the case of Jordan and Lebanon jointly and saying, as middle-income countries, we're seeing more influx. We have the experience and the knowledge that this is going to be very protracted. It's not going to be resolved anytime soon. And we're seeing our fiscal space deteriorate significantly, that we had to trigger an IMF austerity program, now the second in a row. And it became very clear that something has to give in. If we're not going to get the financing right, it's going to be impossible to do the moral and the right thing. And because you're going to be in a position where you're going to actually say, if I do this to a refugee, I'm going to do less to my own citizen. And that's a very difficult thing to do in anywhere in the world. So think today in the US, what we experienced, think if America had to absorb 65 million people. That's the ratio of what we dealt with. So think 65 million people coming into the US. Don't factor in how much higher the per capita income of the US is, how much water is available, other resources, and so on. But think about it as a citizen in America, when you absorb all of a sudden 65 million people, and you're thinking about your tax policy, your job policy, everything else you're trying to do. Do you keep the refugees in the camps? Do you allow them to leave the camps? Do you let them integrate, and so on? When you start to ask these questions, but understand the scale of that issue, the carrying capacity, what and how much more you can do, I think it starts to bring, the difficulty in all of that. And that's why, we realized very early on that if we don't get the financing to work well, this is not going to be sustainable. We won't be able to continue doing the great things we've done in Jordan vis-a-vis the different refugee populations. And you're talking to a country today where 1 in 3 in our country is a registered refugee with UNHCR or with UNRWA. Just so you understand, we're not newcomers to this, unfortunately. We've been dealing over 70 years with conflicts around us and hosting refugee populations, and we know the reality of protracted nature of the crisis. So the hard part in all of this, I think, is what we do with the refugees cannot be isolated from the overall economic situation. And what people also forget, especially donors, is that usually when you're neighboring a conflict, that conflict and instability worsens your economic situation. It lowers your growth rate. So for us as Jordan, just so you know it, we were highly integrated economically to the markets within the region. Our big export markets in the region were Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Libya, Yemen. And you know what happened to these countries. So when you lose your markets, you have less investment, you have more uncertainty, you have terrorism, you have violence all around you. All your economic indicators are going down. So your own population is getting worse off economically. And at the same time, donors are asking you to do more with the refugees. And we started to do the things we did with the refugees, not because anyone asked us, because it was the right thing, it was the moral thing, it was the legal thing to do in the right way vis-a-vis the refugees. But there's a limit to how much a country can do. So while we were dealing with all of that, the conflicts disrupted the markets for us. All of this made it harder for us fiscally to sustain the ability to do what we're doing, and hence the Global Concessional Financing Facility. But the reality still, it came in 5 years late, and it's still a battle year in, year out to get the donors to subsidize or give in some grants to mix it in the financing. And then the overall financing that comes in is still much less than the increased costs of what we're doing. So we deal with $1.5 billion every year of direct costs of providing public services to the refugees. And you get maybe a couple $100 million a year of borrowing money. These are not grants from IBRD. So you're increasing the debt of your own nation and your own citizens, but you're just asking that it's more concessional. And this is the gap that you're confronting. So the scale of these initiatives, they came in late, but they also, to sustain them, is getting harder and harder. And there has to be, within that discussion, we need also the IMF to be sitting. It's not just the World Bank. Because what happens ultimately in these countries that are facing these situations, all of us, is that we fiscally start to crash. Hence, the IMF steps in. Hence, you have a very strong austerity program where we had to do $5 billion from 2012, inclusive of this year, of fiscal measures, meaning we've taken subsidies away and we've increased taxes on our own population to remain fiscally stable, whilst at the same time, we're trying to do all what we're doing in that financing gap. So you have to understand that mix.
Let me just ask you this one. I want to bring Nancy in, but I want to ask you one thing, which is, you're absolutely right about the challenges, the scale of the challenges. But there is a kind of an elegant solution here that you and the bank and others came up with, which included the idea that, okay, yes, only maybe $350 million in grants have been raised out of $1.5 billion, which is the target. It's not enough money yet, but you've got these special economic zones. The EU agreed to reduce tariffs for exporting of, for example, garments, so you could create jobs, you could get refugees into those jobs. You've got this elegant solution, or at least the beginning of it. How is that going? I know it looks maybe more elegant on paper than in the reality of how it works on the ground. But very briefly, give us a sense of what's your picture from how it's going?
The Jordan Compact, which we proposed in London in 2016, was very much because of our historical experience, realizing that the refugees should be looked at as a development asset. And we always thought in Jordan that that's the right approach. I mean, it's part of our melting pot, it's part of our geopolitical positioning, it's part of our history, tradition in terms of how we dealt with waves of people that have crossed into our border. And hence this idea, let's turn this into an economic development opportunity. Let's think of the refugees as a surplus labor pool. So given that, we proposed a holistic framework, the Jordan Compact, which is very much the framework of a lot of the innovation that we're seeing now and hopefully gets factored into the Global Compact on refugees and the Global Compact on displacement. There, we've done, I think, well on increasing funding on a grant basis to the response plans we develop every year in full partnership with the international community, the UN agencies, the INGOs. It's nationally led, nationally owned, and we've seen, compared to 2013, 14, 15, in the last 2 years, the international community provided support to cover 1/3 of the needs. It went up to covering 2/3 of the needs. So there's been an improvement. Of course, there's been 4 years of big deficits that we had to incur that no one compensated you for, and hence the increased debt and fiscal austerity program and all of that. On the education side, we've done very well because we took an approach that you should have no lost Syrian generation on our own territory in Jordan. And we went very aggressively to make sure that we push as many Syrian boys and girls to be in public schools and provide all the support needed for that. On the other reforms, we stayed with the IMF on the austerity reforms because we always acknowledge that if we lose our fiscal stability, then it will be worse off for everyone. And yet, I would argue here we need to be thinking about how much can you pressure a country to do more for refugees while at the same time to do severe austerity. That has not factored into the discussion globally, and we are the case point where this has not yet trickled into the model of doing that.
And as you mentioned,
and
you're
on the
asked
rules,
to take on debt
yes,
in this
course,
context.
Of course.
Yeah.
And where we've seen less progress was on the trade side. So we thought, could we think of producing products made by Jordanians and refugees, a type of a brand or a label of a product? And I think this is where we failed, and I think we should put the most support, is this idea, can we look at ways to integrate ventures, investments, and factories into the global supply chains? Because there you create sustainable solutions that don't need aid, but they make us actually come up with good solutions. We did a great success with IKEA, where IKEA came in. We established in Jordan a facility with 500 women, 250 Syrians, 250 Jordanians, and they were creating products designed by IKEA, and IKEA purchases them through their global supply chain. That's been very successful. They sold in IKEA Jordan, they're going to be selling in New York, and they're going to go global. If we can get more global corporations to go away from CSR, but to really go into this model, I think this has a chance to do great success. And the EU system was trying to do that, which is get companies to export under easier arrangements. I think this is an area where we really need to push the envelope, because I think this is where we deal with all the problems. Right. Because you create jobs, real jobs, into new markets when your regional markets are shrinking and getting worse off. And it takes a lot of effort, of course, to do that. But I think in addition to the financing, I see the trade export side is the other area where we could really be more creative in doing solutions.
So we will come back to this point, I'm sure, throughout the discussion, because fundamentally, when you talk about moving from humanitarian to development, it is about things like livelihoods, jobs. It is these kind of longer-term development challenges, which are really hard. Building a garment sector or a manufacturing sector that can be part of the global supply chain. So we need to get back to this, because if you don't fix that, you really, the rest of the policy, the financing facility is just a means to that end, and that has to be achieved at some point in all of the countries that you've mentioned. I want to bring Nancy Birdsall into the discussion, in part because we're in your space. This is the Birdsall Conference Center, I believe, is the name of the location, and also a lot of the ideas we're talking about, you originated many of them. Looking at the compact, it has a pay for results component to it, something the Center for Global Development has been a big champion of. This idea of moving from humanitarian to development and thinking about new approaches to financing through institutions like the World Bank is something you have thought a lot about, written a lot about, and pushed pretty hard on over many years. So I'd love to get your thoughts about how this has developed and what's missing. Where does this need to go yet?
Great. I do want to start by saying I feel a little bit like the odd woman out, but I like the question. Okay. And I think the organizers have set me up well. So let me start by saying that the Global Concessional Financing Facility is a huge innovation. I think the reality of today's discussion is all about that. And the entrance of wording like differential pricing and flexible financing. I just want to emphasize first how central that is. It is, and say, kudos to the World Bank, to Jim Kim, to Kristalina, and others for introducing this. I mean, IDA was a huge innovation back in 1960. This is comparable, and I hope at some point this kind of idea will have equivalent financing that really meets the needs in the way that IDA has met or helped meet the needs of the poorest countries. So what do I mean? So the innovation is around this financing approach. And it builds on the reality that the World Bank, and I hope the other MDBs will follow, is brilliant at raising money. It's brilliant at raising money from donors, but increasingly from emerging market economies as well, because it has the trust of those donors, particularly on its fiduciary and legal infrastructure. And everyone knows that it knows what to do in development. So in moving from humanitarian to development. So that's the first thing to say. And it's a big innovation because the World Bank for 70 years, in a way, has been tied to its business model, which is incredibly successful. And its business model is built around country-based loans at below market prices, but in effect subsidized because the World Bank and the other MDBs can borrow cheaply at low rates and pass on the benefits in the form of somewhat cheaper loans with better terms to IBRD countries. And the IDA machine, we just, you have to be amazed at what has happened in the last year and a half. The incredible amount of money raised, including by borrowing from IDA. Okay, so, but the history is that the rating agencies see an institution that knows how to do financing and it knows how to raise money and it can be trusted on all of those things. But the constraint has always been built on a country-based loan with a sovereign counter guarantee that is part of creating a sustainable model. So what to do about refugees, what to do about pandemics and climate change, it's really tough. So now this GCFF is showing the way. And I really hope it can be the thin edge of the wedge for something else. Let me say, to not be boring, what's wrong and what could be addressed and must be addressed. So it's kind of a message for Kristalina. But, well, the other thing about the World Bank that's so important on this GCFF is everything that Minister Farkouti said. It knows how to work with countries. Its comparative advantage as a bank is interacting with countries on policy issues, on fiscal issues, et cetera, on how to create jobs, whatever. So what's wrong? Well, first, it's so, I call it the begging bowl approach, right? The first idea that came from you in 2015, now we're in 2017. I mean, Jim Kim going around with the begging bowl, right, to the donors. Every 6 months, another round of pledging. All these work. How can you do long-term development investments on this short-term money?
And it's just pledging is not even the whole story. There's pledging and then there's actually getting the money. I think the Japan and the US, the two biggest donors, are only halfway through so far,
right? So that's one thing. Second, it's very dependent on the latest, I mean, I don't want to be quoted exactly, but it's like the latest donor fad and fear. And the Syrian war generated a lot of fear, especially in Europe. And we can't do what Cindy referred to as anything like medium-term loans with incentives for countries to deal with prevention in the case of whether it's climate change or health surveillance in order that pandemics don't spread. With the begging bowl approach, that's why the world created IDA, because IDA has a kind of sustainability. So, it's this issue that the minister referred to of the battle year in and year out to raise this money. And this is just for refugees. I think of it as the Miliband effect.
I haven't caused all these refugees. That's a bit of a...
Well, but you helped bring, shift from the fear to what could be done, as did, colleagues in the international conversation at the World Bank and the other banks. So how do we go from this essentially trust fund, heavily donor dependent, and donors have to be kind of short term, to exploit the wonder of the multilateral development banks that now have trust, they have money, we could put capital into a wonderfully boringly named GCFF that would generate income over time to deal with other pressing issues of global public bads.
Before we get into all those, because I do want to get into all those, I also want to tell the audience here and those following online, we're going to take questions even during the middle of this discussion. So if you've got some good ones, start to think of those. If you want to send them in online on Twitter, I think it's hashtag CGD Talks to post your question, and they'll be brought up here. Before we get into talking about some of the other possible ways we can use this, I just want to make sure we get back.
I couldn't resist.
I know, and we will get there. I just want to make sure we get back to David's, I think, very important points. You know, there's the financing challenge. It's hard to raise the money, but once you raise it, it's really hard to spend it well. You need to have the way to evaluate. You need to have accountability. You need to have the right processes. Tell us how we get there.
It actually, this is one of these cases when glass is kind of half, you can call it half full or you can call it half empty. I would call it half full. What Nancy said is very important. We are discussing here a particular set of projects and programs, but they are in the context of our engagement with Jordan, with Lebanon, with Turkey. And in this engagement, we look at ways in which we can generate jobs, we can bring a higher trust of the business community to invest more. We just had a conference on Lebanon, at which, on behalf of the bank group, not just IBRD, but also IFC, I made a over $4 billion pledge that over the next 5 years, we guarantee to be present. Part of this pledge is the concessional facility, but the bigger chunk is our overall program. And what we are calling on is for finance to be seen exactly as the minister described it, in a context of overall strategic longer-term development plan. So while we are pursuing the facility as such, it is part of a broader engagement. And there we also talk to the other development banks. We do talk to the fund. We have a softer, I think, softer heart. So we do all this. And that is where I agree very much with David. That has to be placed with some clear objectives, measurable outcomes. How do we know we are making progress? I'll give you an example from Ethiopia. We have out of our IDA refugee window, because we have applied the same logic then back to the IDA countries, we have a program that is about generating 100,000 jobs in industrial parks, 30,000 for refugees in a bigger context. And I think that is absolutely correct. This is how we have to think about it. If I could add to the point that Nancy made, right now with the global financing facility, we are retailing. We are going with the begging ball and we are collecting money. And it is harder and harder because the first round, people are excited, it's easier. Then other things start competing and then it becomes harder. And I agree wholeheartedly with you that we have to find ways, as we learn the lessons from experience, to finance on a wholesale basis. How could that be done? Well, we are in an institution that actually generates income. And we take this income goes into our reserves and it builds a stronger capital base. It is up to our shareholders to decide how to use that income. And we now have the Global Compact for Refugees forthcoming. It would make a lot of sense, at least for our shareholders, to have an intelligent, informed discussion. I believe we can show the evidence, and this is why, by the way, I'm very happy that your report is coming right now. We can show the evidence. Here is a model that is actually generating responding to the generation of a global public good. And that model deserves to be taken seriously in a way of being put in a sustainable footing. I cannot say, I mean, as management of the institution, of course, we would look into that. And we actually, I can tell you that we have already been talking about using a fraction of our income for global public goods. This is one, there are others. We don't yet have consensus on that. And as we all know, it takes time for an idea changing the way the business model of the bank to come to fruition, and rightly so. We are a very conservative institution. Part of the trust of everybody in us is because we are so conservative. I always say the World Bank, imagine a man that wants to hold pants, suspenders, belt, hands in the pockets. This is us. But when we walk a couple of kilometers in this way, we can take one hand out of the pocket. And that is what I believe is going to be coming as a discussion. And your voices would be very important because we do not make these decisions lightly, but you're right. There is ground on the basis of experience and proven value for the world, for the countries, and for the refugees that are long-term there. That model produces results.
Could I ask a tough question?
Please do.
So I'm remembering, when was Bob Zoellick the president? It's been 10 years, right? Almost 10 years. Yeah. I asked him at a conference about, it was about climate. You know, how could the World Bank do better on dealing with climate given its business model or something like that? And I gave some answer at the conference, and he blah, 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 sort of. And then he collared me afterwards, and he said, look, there's no way. The poorest countries are adamant that, you know, they get IDA partly financed by transfers of net income from IBRD. The middle income countries, and we say this in the report that Cindy referred to, they don't want any money transferred that way. They say that will increase through the algorithm that generates the need to be careful and prudent, higher costs of borrowing on IBRD. And the rich donors, well, whatever, they're quite happy with the trust fund approach. So I'm just saying that to give you a sense of the challenge that Kristalina and colleagues face politically. But the same challenge has existed before. And if there's any institution that can deal with this, it's the World Bank.
Agreed. We get, I'll tell you very interestingly, yesterday we had the chance to revisit one of these issues when we start from categorically no, and then a couple of years later it is done. And it is the IDA bond. The International Development Association has been for a long time replenishment by donors. No touch of markets. We do not go to markets. In fact, treasurers of the World Bank would tell you the way they would sell IBRD bonds is, this is not IDA. Not IDA, we can sell it. Yesterday, we issued our inaugural IDA bond. Initially, we thought we would place 1 billion, but the demand was so high, 4.6 times oversubscribed, we ended up issuing 1.5 billion with very, very AAA, very low cost of borrowing. And people at that ceremony yesterday, many of them would say, we never thought this would be possible. I started by saying the value of the bank is to lean forward, adapt to what is changing as demand on us in a very prudent manner. So while I agree with you that this is a very difficult to touch the business model of the institution, difficult, but not impossible.
Not impossible. In fact, I just want to underline something you said a moment ago that people here may not have caught. You know the global concessional financing facility for middle-income countries like Jordan, you mentioned there was a window created under IDA, a $2 billion window, to achieve basically the same objectives
That's why I
that
asked
under
you
IDA
about it.
countries.
Yes,
And
yes,
it
yes.
worked. It was
Oh,
And
the
that's not a
refugee
small-
window is working. Yes, yes, we have 2 billion already. 8 countries are classified as eligible. 15 projects are prepared. Projects are moving.
So let's bring the conversation now to the second component here, which is we've talked mostly about displaced people. We've brought up a little bit about climate change. There are maybe other global public good problems out there. How can the international financial system, not just the World Bank, but even thinking beyond that, how do we get to a point where these global public goods can be financed when we're in a world where basically lending is thought of as a country by country basis? Nancy, this is something you've thought a lot about.
Well-
Very, very briefly, give us a sense of the lay of the land and where we can go.
You know, I think it's fair to assume at all moments in time, including the future, global public goods will be underfunded. So it's useful to start with that assumption, because no single country has a sufficient incentive to put money into global public goods. So, you know, one of the things that I think is exciting about the GCFF is that it's showing there's a collective financing model out there called the multilateral development banks, you know, invented at Bretton Woods. And this is the start of how that instrument, which is a collective, it's a credit cooperative, can be at the center of a cooperative effort, you know. I would say the next step might be to start thinking about how would you have governance? What would be, how could you link governance to raising money? To have some capital as well as maybe some transfers of net income. Wouldn't you want to have emerging markets involved in that governance, the middle income countries that don't have refugees, that see any transfer of net income to some other window as costing them something, then you need to give them a say. Wouldn't it be nice to have capital from China, which might like to put investment and have a little bit more engagement and a little bit more influence? So that it's not so much the traditional donors on which everything. So, you know, you could be imaginative about it. I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
You are. Let me ask David, too, as well.
Right.
When you think about where this goes, is it in your mind, well, we have the global financing facility now for displaced people. Let's just use that. Let's just expand that. Or do you imagine a broader reconstruction of the international system?
We've got to use the mechanisms that we've got, that we've created well. I mean, it would be terrible not to make the most of them. But I think that there are issues that are raised. One is that to think about groups of countries, not just countries on their own. So if you think about the countries that are hosting refugees from Somalia or from Congo, they're in a cluster. And I wonder if we don't need to think about this on a sub-regional basis, not just on a national basis. Because remember, the populations move not just from the country of origin to another country, they then move between those countries. So I think that occurs to me. We're kind of interested in insurance for countries. I mean, there's this whole debate about social impact bonds. I'm not the right person to talk about it, but I think that the question of whether or not, I mean, put it this way, Uganda has done an amazing job in the last year in hosting South Sudanese refugees. Those of us who were involved in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in South Sudan in 2006, the referendum in 2011, was there ever a conversation with the Ugandans that said, look, what happens on, what's the insurance against the dark side of this going wrong in South Sudan? Because essentially the Ugandans have had to step up to this themselves. So it's genuinely a question, because I am a student here, not an expert on global financing mechanisms, whether or not there's anything in this social impact stroke insurance area. I mean, you obviously don't want to have a category of countries that, these countries might blow up, so what are you going to do next door? But I think that there are a set of states that have I mean, you can think about Jordan, which has a long history of hosting refugees. It's not. I would be interested in that. And then the final thing is that I am intrigued with the notion that the World Bank and the IMF are thinking about the financing support for a country together, and that takes you into the debt relief, etc. areas. One of the things I talked about, I published a book at the end of last year, and I sort of tried to reflect on, we had debt relief for the HIPC countries, the highly indebted poor countries, and I got some work underway about, well, what about the HIPC brackets parenthesis R, which are refugee hosting countries. I haven't been able to bring this work to a conclusion, but it does seem to me that if you're Jordan and you've got a pretty proximate relationship between the arrival of the refugees and the growth of your debt, what is the extent to which you're, how is that factored into
Well, let's ask the minister.
Well, it's very hard for, it's not, you put him in an impossible position because he's got, the IMF are watching, sitting at their desks, listening to what he says. I want to say he's very tough. He's very, very tough. He's very committed, But I think we've got to understand the full implications of what Imad is saying about, let's look at this in the round, about the global support for the countries that are doing this hosting.
Right, and it has implications even for the debt sustainability framework of the IMF and the banks.
And so we're going to hear from the minister, but I want to alert you, we are going to go to questions just after we hear from the minister. So if you're thinking about formulating one, now is the time. Tel, you referred to this a bit earlier, that we need to think of this holistically, which is how you have to look at it at the country level.
Correct.
What do you want to see beyond this facility that's been created, briefly?
So while we were negotiating with the IMF our austerity programs, the standby arrangement in 2012, and which ended 2 years ago, and the current extended fund facility, which is a back-to-back second program, the IMF, given its rules, its structure, its framework, the only thing they could do, in essence, to help us was to say, we call upon the donors, and they went to the G7, to the G20, and kept mentioning that it would be nice to, you outside there, our austerity program remains the same. It's not changed because we have these circumstances, but give Jordan more budget support grants. And of course, the reality is one or two countries increased a little bit some of the assistance, but the reality, the size, that has not happened. And that's why I think it's very important. I really think this is a moment in the 21st century, the disclassification of middle income, low income, we really need to relook and re-examine that. And I think the dollars or the euros or the RMBs or whatever it is that's coming to help development, humanitarian assistance, I think the dollars have to follow the refugees, the carbon, the needs. And then you look at middle-income countries. So you see a country like Jordan in the Middle East or Colombia in Latin America. They're middle-income countries. They were moving very well, and then they had to absorb populations, and you easily go back. So our development gains, we went from an upper middle-income country to a low middle-income country, of no fault of our own, just because we decided to keep the borders open and do the right and moral thing and do things well. You look at the incentive system globally, the incentive system says, if Jordan is managing the crisis well, I'll worry about them later. And let's go help those who screwed up the management of a conflict or a refugee situation, and the money rushes there. So in essence, there's a double penalty for you even in that structure. So ODA alone is not going to do it. I want to remind you all, given the protracted nature, we have to come back to Addis Ababa and financing for development scheme, which is a much bigger approach. There has to be additionality. We can't forget the basic humanitarian needs. We have donor countries telling us today that you should now integrate the refugee issue into your long-term development plan. And we're pushing back and saying, we can do that, assuming, there is an expansion of the economy, and there's an expansion also of some additionality of resources. Because at the end, if you force us to do this on its own, you're actually asking countries to channel resources from their own citizens towards others at the expense of their own citizens. And when you deal with an elected parliament and when you're dealing with an accountable. Your own parliament is not going to allow this to happen, and they're going to push back, especially with the populist politics in the world that we see today. So I really think the discussion of the overall financing for development under the different elements and what you do in concessionary and what you do with public-private partnerships using the cascading approach of the World Bank that we're working together on, the IFC to do more through PPPs in terms of development. All of these pieces have to come together along with the piece that I'm trying to push harder also for, which is trade access and companies linking their global supply chains to initiatives where there's a brand. If it's a refugee contribution to it, it should be given an interesting branding, and I think consumers worldwide would like to buy products made by a company that's actually saying we're also helping refugees.
Yeah, and a favorable entry to the market. Okay, we are going to go to questions. I think there's some mics that are going to come around, and we have someone here from the EIB, I believe. So Romualdo Bernucci is here. If you might give us our first question or comment. You've been very involved in this, and so it'd be nice to hear what the EIB view is on this discussion.
Does some of this in its own.
What have we missed?
Nothing. In fact, thank you very much for inviting me. The challenges are so formidable that the key word that has been said very often is partnership. We have to be together. The minister just said it perfectly. All the pieces should come together. This is what you just said. So this is certainly what is happening. Yes, the global concessional financing facility, we cooperate on this, and we try also to develop a special window for private sector, by the way. The EIB has also developed another initiative, which is the Economic Resilience Initiative, which targets the Western Balkans, Middle East, or Jordan, and the MENA region as it holds. So with an objective of having more plus 6 billion euros. This is euros up to 2020. So in addition to what is done. Certainly, one observation is that whatever we do, the resources we have will not be, say, sufficient. Therefore, the blending instruments are certainly extremely important because we can operate on this basis more in team and with other resources. But there is also an issue about using better in an innovative way the resources, the scarce resources that we have. For instance, grant funds or resources that are available could be used rather than grants and subsidies. Also think about using them as guarantees, instruments like that, because we have a lessons learned, for instance, under investment plan for Europe, where guarantees did a lot in terms of multiplication of mobilization of funds on the market. So definitely this is a way forward where we would like to be together. We continue to be together, because I would like to mention another initiative on migration that is happening, and it is the migration platform that World Bank and the EIB together with other MDBs are promoting together, and it's absolutely formidable for me and for the observers that are saying, well, this is happening really. And it is basically joining forces and sharing the pipeline and trying to coordinate technical assistance. So it's something very, very, very visible. But my comment, my query is, can't we do more to, in a way or another, attract the private sector as well, wherever is possible, to create jobs that are, as the minister is saying, real jobs. So these that are going to stay.
Sustainable.
In order to this to happen, we have to consider also the micro businesses, the SMEs, and what goes with that is also vocational training in order to allow the people, the refugees, to learn how to work in a company and therefore create maybe their own business and help them creating their business in their country, which then creates other jobs. So I think that's I think an area where we should be together and do more.
Thank you very much for that. And I want to make sure the panel has a chance to respond, but I do want to see if there's any other. Got James Michael behind you, and then maybe was there another hand or two? I thought I saw one back there as well. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks very much. Fascinating and encouraging and at the same time depressing subject here. I wanted to raise it one.
Jim, introduce yourself.
Jim Michael. I'm a consultant these days.
But
background in
yes.
many lives.
Used to chair the DAC, among other things.
Right.
But the problem is of such enormous magnitude. When you talk about 22.5 million refugees, 55 million people forced out of their homes, and it doesn't stop. You know, what's next? You know, we had this enormous problem, and then we had people flowing into Bangladesh from Myanmar. Now we have our people leaving Venezuela. You know, it just goes on and on.
Colombia. Yeah.
And the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, has put a primary priority on prevention. The World Bank has joined with the UN in this Pathways for Peace initiative, which talks about prevention and participation and reducing. And the politics, something that several of the panelists have mentioned, are all reactive rather than preventive. So that getting how do you get beyond coming up with innovative ways to diminish the highly negative impact of this enormous and growing problem and get to a preventive strategy that will make the problem become more manageable so that these innovative financing arrangements can have a more sustainable impact. Now, that may be beyond the scope of this.
No, I appreciate you're adding an important note of urgency into the discussion. We're going to take one last really brief comment. Sorry that someone else got to it first, but I will come back to you as well. Maybe one more very quickly. But please keep it really short. Just tell us who you are as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Juan Coderque. I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross, who is of late in a very close relationship with the World Bank. Sir, you were saying there's an enormous problem with refugees, but that is just, sorry to make it more depressing, that is only part of the problem. You have twice as many IDPs, internally displaced people affected for the most part by conflict situations.
40 million.
And you also have the rest of the civilian population who cannot move but still affected. So I think you cannot solve or just focus on the refugee issue. You're going to have to look at the source of the problem.
Good point. We're taking one more thought here. Please.
I'm Caroline Benson with the World Bank, also working on forced displacement. I have a quick question regarding the burden sharing, because you talk quite a bit on how to make this financing sustainable. But if we look at the number of countries that are hosting, it's pretty constant. It's a fairly small group of countries that are hosting a large majority of the refugees. And then if you look at the donors, that's also sort of the usual suspects, right? So we actually have, I think, part of the Global Compact of Refugees is this whole question of burden sharing. We have a fantastic panel here coming from 4 different sectors that have separate conversations with donors and governments and others. Are there any comments on how can we increase that burden sharing? How can we get all the countries that are doing very little, how can we get them on board, so not just making it sustainable, but also basically, have a better burden sharing in the future?
It's a great comment. Now, sadly, because we're in the middle of the spring meetings and you all have other places to be, we're not going to be able to address all of those great questions, but I'm glad we got them on the floor at least. And maybe you can all just briefly give us one sentence to help tie together the key point you would like to leave us with. This is such an important topic. We could be here for another hour, but I know you have places to go as well. Please, Nancy, can we start with you?
I'd say one possibility on how to get beyond the current situation on refugees is I have colleagues here at CGD that are developing ideas and a scheme. I'm sure somebody from the IRC is on the working group. Cindy knows about it. That is essentially a refugee resettlement scheme that would imagine, voucher-like refugees have the right to go somewhere, Brazil, Chile, Malaysia, Thailand, if they can be matched with a possible host country, which then has the access to the money associated with each refugee. Now, that's not a way to burden share on the financing necessarily, but it's a way to burden share on the hosting and to mitigate some of the problems that arise for countries like Jordan and Lebanon that are hosting so many, and of course, low-income countries too. So the other thing I would say in answer to a different question, how to deal with burden sharing in general, that's why the MDBs seem important to me in their financing role, because they're collective, they're cooperatives fundamentally. And so, you know, they're a setting where you can negotiate arrangements, including for burden sharing with all countries, and where you can give some of the poorest and middle-income developing countries voice in both whether they would host, to be that's a specific example, but more important, voice in seeing the costs that they share without, you know, they can't set a priority. South Africa can't set a priority on renewables in a world of least cost power. You know, Jordan can't set a priority on dealing with refugees, where the IMF is saying you must have this austerity program. But these are shared problems, and the great thing about our credit cooperatives that we call multilateral development banks is they bring people together in a way that could lead to a more collective approach to financing, sustainable financing.
David, maybe 2 sentences.
We
are over time, and I know you've got to get going.
Sentence number one is that it's very important that people speak to the crisis of diplomacy that exists, which is fueling civil wars, which is meaning, as famously said, the likeliest legacy of a civil war is another civil war. And until we have political leadership that's determined enough to say that although South Sudan doesn't appear on most countries' list of concerns, it's only going to be diplomacy that brings that war to an end. And I don't even need to get into the Syria nightmare to make the same point. So people are right in this forum to raise a crisis of diplomacy and point the finger at powerful countries, permanent members of the Security Council and others, some of whom are aiding and abetting breaches of international law, others of whom have completely abandoned the field of trying to end wars. And so people should be really pointing the finger there. Secondly, on the, I don't like the phrase burden sharing, but responsibility sharing front, Europe got interested when the refugees arrived, let's be honest about it. And they were asleep in 2013 and 2014. Sorry to say it, they were dealing with the Euro, more diplomatic thing to say, they were dealing with the Euro crisis, they were dealing with the Ukraine crisis. It's when the refugees arrived that they got interested. And the truth is that we've got to make the case that in a connected world, this is everyone's challenge. I'd also say, much more controversially, that we need to focus overseas development aid on fragile states. The UK, it wasn't a decision that the government I was in took, but subsequent governments have said 50% of their aid is going to go to fragile states. And if you think about the success of the campaign against global poverty, it's been driven by market economics more than it's been driven by aid handouts. And it's really important that we focus aid where it can do most good. And the truth is that it can do most good in those fragile or failing states where the economy isn't working. And that's a very difficult conversation to have, but it's not, I actually want to see the aid budget increasing, and you can see some ways of spreading the benefit. But I do think that the marginal dollar has got to go to the fragile state rather than the stable, growing, but nonetheless with significant numbers of poor people, because the geography of poverty is changing. 40% plus of the extreme poor who are life-threatened live in fragile or conflict states. And that is going to be 65% by 2030 if you look at the Brookings Institution numbers. And I think when the MDGs were created in 2000, it was like 12% or something. And so that's where the marginal dollar has to go.
Kristalina.
Well, I mean, my answer to the questions, okay, so what do we do, would be relentless pursuit of solutions that rationally appeal to people to sign on. It is kind of enlightened self-interest. And I am a big believer that we can, in these cooperatives, be the space where enlightened self-interest leads to the right thing to be done. Extreme poverty is going up and up and up in places like, I mean, I think South Sudan is the record holder, or maybe Syria. In South Sudan, it was
Yemen is the
maybe Yemen, yeah. But this is a fact that shook us all, but it doesn't so much, or it shakes us in the morning and then by the evening we forget. So how you translate this into what is in for me in different places? This is a role for us. We are actually creating a joint data center with UNHCR. We are partnering with the European Investment Bank on this platform on migration, because we feel that we have to send that signal. Trouble travels. It has long legs. As humanitarian commissioner in these days when Europe was going on the refugee crisis, I would be sending letter after letter saying, look, this is like slow-moving tsunami. It's going to come and hit us. And people didn't pay attention until it hit us. So the question is how to translate that more effectively. And I think we have to spare no effort for this relentless pursuit of making it an answer to the question, what is in for me? Middle-income country, not affected, affected. And I have the faith that actually we can do this collectively. Do not abandon this topic. Do not abandon it, even if it is out of fashion. Stay on it, because the tsunami is still out there. And if anything, it is getting bigger unfortunately, in so many places.
Minister, a final thought.
65 million people is probably now, in terms of forced displacement, is the largest growing country in the world, if you look at it. And I think just the way that the Syria crisis rudely awakened the European continent, when people started to go in the boats and flood the borders, I think this crisis and its implications globally are going to continue to rudely awaken the world. So what we're doing here is very important. Prevention without diplomacy and political leadership is not going to happen. I mean, clearly. So what we're all doing does not mean we're also giving up the political tracks, pushing on the Geneva process for Syria and all of that. And we can't abandon that, but we're also trying to deal with the day in, day out realities that we have to deal with. We are now moving with the World Bank and the IMF to go into the guarantee scheme, where we're taking what we piloted in Jordan under the Global Concessional Financing Facility to move into a 5-year bigger program with IBRD, where donors come in because there's a limited headroom on financing, and they give in, not cash, just guarantees to help us borrow more and manage the financing as we continue the IMF program and that.
Cheaper.
So we are quite advanced on this. On Saturday, we have a critical donor meeting with the World Bank on that. So Jordan, we are going to keep fighting the fight, and we're going to leave no stone unturned, and we're going to remain holistic. It's our will to survive, and it's our voice to keep the world conscious awakened. And we're not going to back down, and I want people to leave the room saying, yes, it's a challenge, yes, it's growing, but we can together collectively push this and stay the course and change the way we bring in financing for development to help fragile or conflict-affected states, and hopefully align the incentives correctly that you are rewarding those who are doing the right thing at the right time.
And I think that is the storyline. as we close, and I think that's a perfect point to close on, that really is the storyline here. We got in a very rich discussion into a lot of details about how these mechanisms work. But the thing you must take away, I hope you take away from this conversation, is this was not inevitable. Creating this kind of facility required leadership. It was not easy to pull this off. It was not easy to get to this point. And at some point, I think we may have a Nobel Peace Prize go to a financial engineer. And it could be one of these people on the stage here. I don't know. I think as we think about the big challenges that Jim rightly laid out, a critical way of getting there is taking the tools we already have, applying the kind of leadership you're hearing from the panelists to actually make it happen. And that's really the story that we're here today to partly celebrate and partly push to get further. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Center for Global Development. It's been a pleasure.